6 months after the failed peace negotiations at the Galactic Council, the war was finally over. The last Zephyrian military installation had surrendered 3 days ago, and now Chancellor Kethvex sat in a detention cell aboard the human dreadnought, Remembrance, waiting for transport to Earth where he would face trial for genocide. The cell was simple but not cruel, a small room with basic furniture, adequate lighting, and access to educational materials. It was more comfortable than the prison camps Kethvex had built for human captives, though Admiral Katya Rodriguez doubted the former chancellor appreciated the irony. Rodriguez walked slowly down the corridor toward the detention block, her footsteps echoing off the metal walls. At 62, she was too old to be commanding a frontline warship, but the crew of the Remembrance had specifically requested her for this final mission. They wanted someone who had been there from the beginning, someone who remembered what it felt like to watch worlds burn. The guard at the detention block saluted as she approached. "Admiral, the prisoner has been expecting you." Rodriguez nodded and entered the cell block. Through the energy barrier, she could see Kethvex sitting motionless on his simple cot, staring at the wall. The once mighty ruler of the Zephyrian Empire looked smaller now, his chitinous exoskeleton dull and his bioluminescent markings, barely flickering. Age and defeat had reduced him to something Rodriguez almost felt sorry for, almost. "Chancellor," she said quietly, activating the communication system. Kethvex turned his massive head toward her, his compound eyes reflecting the cell's harsh lighting. "Admiral Rodriguez, I wondered if you would come." They had met before during prisoner exchanges and brief ceasefires over the years. Rodriguez had always found Kethvex to be intelligent and articulate, which somehow made his crimes worse. It was easier to hate mindless monsters than thinking beings who chose to become monsters. "I wanted to see you before you're transferred to Earth," Rodriguez said, settling into the chair outside his cell. "The trial will begin in 2 weeks. Kethvex made a sound that might have been laughter in his species. "A trial, as if the outcome is in doubt. Your people have already decided my fate." "The outcome isn't in doubt," Rodriguez agreed. "But the process matters. We're not going to execute you in secret or make you disappear. The galaxy will see exactly what happens when someone tries to commit genocide against humanity." The Chancellor shifted on his cot, his forearms folding in what Rodriguez recognized as a gesture of resignation. "You still don't understand, do you? Your species cannot sustain this level of military spending indefinitely. Economic reality will force you to accept a more practical approach to galactic relations." Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, studying the alien who had ordered the deaths of billions of her people. Even now, even after losing everything, he was still thinking like a conqueror, still calculating advantages and weaknesses, still trying to find an angle that would let him win. "You're still thinking like a predator, Chancellor. You still believe that everyone else operates the same way you do, that eventually we'll get tired of justice and settle for profit." She stood and walked closer to the energy barrier. "But you taught us something important about this galaxy. You taught us that there are creatures who look civilized on the outside but are monsters underneath. You taught us that genocide is just another tool of statcraft to some species." Kethvex's markings flared slightly, the first sign of emotion she had seen from him. "And what did you learn from that lesson, Admiral?" "We learned that the only way to prevent another massacre is to make sure everyone understands the price of attempting one." Rodriguez activated her personal datapad, showing him footage from the past year of warfare. "Look at what we've done, Chancellor. We've dismantled your entire empire. We've captured or destroyed every military asset you possessed. We've liberated 8 worlds that you conquered from other species." The images showed the systematic destruction of Zephyrian military power. Shipyards reduced to scrap metal. Command centers turned to rubble. Fleet bases that had intimidated this sector for centuries now floating as debris in space. "But look what we didn't do," Rodriguez continued. "We didn't glass your worlds. We didn't poison your oceans or turn your atmosphere toxic. We didn't round up Zephyrian civilians and put them in camps. We didn't do any of the things you did to us." Kethvex watched the footage in silence for several minutes. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Your restraint is ... Most species would have sought revenge. Most species didn't lose 2.3 billion people in a single day, Rodriguez replied. Most species didn't watch their children die from poison gas while the galaxy looked the other way. We had every right to turn your worlds into dead rocks, and you know it. She paused the footage on an image of Zephyr Prime, the Chancellor's homeworld. 4 billion Zephyrians live there, going about their daily lives under the protection of human fleets that could have ended their civilization with a single order. But we're not you, Chancellor. We don't murder innocents because we're angry at their government. We don't commit genocide because it's convenient. We fight for justice, not revenge. Kethvex was quiet for a long time, studying the image of his homeworld. And when your justice is complete, when I am dead and my government is destroyed, what then? Rodriguez smiled, but it was a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. Then we go home. We rebuild our colonies, we mourn our dead, and we get on with our lives. We're not interested in ruling your empire or enslaving your people. But, Kethvex prompted, sensing there was more, but we'll never forget what you taught us about this galaxy, and we'll never again be the weak, trusting species that other civilizations can prey upon. Rodriguez closed her datapad and looked directly into the Chancellor's compound eyes. We've built something more valuable than an empire, Chancellor. We've built a guarantee. A guarantee of what? That no one will ever again mistake humanity for easy prey. That any species considering genocide will have to ask themselves if they're prepared to face what happened to you. Rodriguez gestured toward the cell's walls. Every government in this sector now knows that there's a species out there that values justice over profit, that fights for principles rather than territory, and that has the power to back up its convictions. Kethvex's bioluminescent markings dimmed further. You have made yourselves into the galaxy's executioners. No, Rodriguez corrected. We've made ourselves into the galaxy's memory. When future would-be conquerors look at star charts and see human territory, they'll remember what happened to the Zephyrian Empire. They'll remember that some crimes carry a price that can never be negotiated away. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Your trial will be broadcast throughout the galaxy. Every species will see the evidence of what you did, and they'll see what happens to those who try to exterminate other thinking beings. Some of them will call us harsh or unforgiving. Rodriguez looked back at the broken ruler sitting in his cell. But none of them will ever call us victims again. As she walked back through the corridors of the Remembrance, Rodriguez thought about the memorial wall on Earth's orbital station. The names of 2.3 billion dead humans, each one representing a life cut short by alien hatred. The wall had grown longer during the war, filled with the names of soldiers and sailors who had died fighting for justice, but it would be the last memorial wall of its kind that humanity would ever need to build. The galaxy had learned to remember the slaughter, and more importantly, it had learned to fear the species that refused to forget. In the detention block behind her, Chancellor Kethvex sat alone with his thoughts, finally understanding that some wounds never heal and some debts can only be paid in full. Outside his small window, the stars of his former empire twinkled peacefully. Protected now by the same human fleets that had brought his civilization to its knees, the war was over, but the lesson would last forever. The Galactic Council chamber had been in session for 72 hours straight, and Ambassador Elena Vasquez was getting tired of listening to aliens lecture humanity about proper behavior. She sat in the human observation booth, watching species after species stand up to condemn human military actions, while carefully avoiding any mention of why those actions had become necessary. The hegemony of worlds had spent 3 hours explaining why human tactics were barbaric and excessive. The Trade Federation had given a presentation about how the war was disrupting commerce throughout the sector. The Crystalline Collective, who prided themselves on logical thinking, had calculated that human military expansion threatened long-term galactic stability. Elena found it fascinating how none of them mentioned the 2.3 billion dead humans that had started this whole mess. Representative Dalthara was speaking now, her crystalline form catching the chamber's artificial light as she gestured toward the central display. The human response has been entirely disproportionate to the original incident, she declared, her voice chiming like broken glass. While we acknowledge that civilian casualties are regrettable, civilized species must respond to conflict through measured diplomatic channels. Elena almost laughed. Original incident? That's what they were calling genocide now. She looked around the chamber at the alien representatives who had watched humanity bleed for 15 years. The snake-like Vorthak delegation who had openly supported the Zephyrian cleansing operation. Because they wanted human colonies for themselves. The gaseous beings of the Drift Collective who had voted against every human request for aid or mediation. The proud warrior culture of the hegemony, who had called humans cowards for not accepting honorable defeat. Only the Corvan Republic had spoken in humanity's defense, and that was because they had fought their own war against Zephyrian expansion 50 years ago. Everyone else in this chamber had either cheered for humanity's destruction or simply looked the other way. Now, with Zephyrian fleets in ruins and their empire crumbling, suddenly everyone was concerned about proportional response and diplomatic solutions. Counselor Rex of the Trade Federation was speaking now, his blob-like form rippling with nervous energy. We must consider the economic implications of continued warfare. Trade routes throughout the sector have been disrupted. Commercial vessels are afraid to enter systems where human warships operate. Elena checked her chronometer. In about 10 minutes, the council would expect her to respond to all these speeches. She had been preparing for this moment for months, working with Earth's best speechwriters and diplomatic advisors. But looking at these aliens now, listening to their carefully worded condemnations, she decided to throw away the prepared remarks. They deserved to hear the truth in its rawest form. Chancellor Kethvek sat silently on his platform, his bioluminescent markings dim with exhaustion. Elena could see the defeat in his posture, the way his forearms hung loosely at his sides. 3 months ago, he had been the supreme ruler of an empire that controlled dozens of star systems. Now he was a war criminal whose own people were abandoning him to save themselves. The chamber fell quiet as Elena stood and walked to the lift. Every eye followed her descent to the main floor, but she ignored them all. She had learned something important during her 2 years in Zephyrian prison camps. When predators show weakness, they expect you to be grateful for their restraint. Elena wasn't feeling grateful. She reached the central platform and looked up at the assembled representatives. These beings represented civilizations thousands of years old, species that had mastered interstellar travel before humans had invented the wheel. They controlled vast fleets and commanded the resources of entire solar systems, and they were all afraid of her. Honorable representatives, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. You've spent 3 days lecturing humanity about proper conduct in warfare. You've told us that our response has been excessive, that we should have accepted Chancellor Kethvek's generous offer of peace, that civilized beings resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than violence. She paused, letting her words sink in. I find that interesting because 15 years ago, when my species was screaming for help, this same council voted against intervention. You said the situation was too complex for outside mediation. You said both sides needed to work out their differences independently. Representative Dalthara shifted uncomfortably. Ambassador, the council's previous decisions were made with limited information? Limited information? Elena's voice rose slightly. You had real-time footage of cities burning. You had refugees begging for sanctuary. You had 3 entire worlds being systematically sterilized by an empire that announced their intention to commit genocide. She activated her personal hologram projector, filling the chamber with images that most of these beings had never seen. Children's bodies lined up in a refugee camp. A father holding his daughter's hand as poison gas rolled through their street. An entire family vaporized by a Zephyrian energy weapon while trying to evacuate their home. The chamber erupted in shocked gasps and horrified chittering. Several delegates looked away from the display, but Elena kept the images running. This is what you called limited information, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. This is what you decided wasn't worth your intervention. Counselor. Rex's blob-like form was quivering. Ambassador, surely we can discuss these matters without such graphic displays. Why? Elena asked. Are the images disturbing? Do they make you uncomfortable? Good. My people lived through this reality while you debated trade agreements and territorial boundaries. She changed the hologram to show footage from the early days of the war, when desperate human fleets had thrown themselves against superior Zephyrian forces with nothing but rage and determination. Ships ramming into alien dreadnoughts because they had run out of ammunition. Pilots flying suicide missions to take out Zephyrian commanders. Soldiers charging weapon positions that should have been impossible to assault. You want to know why humans won't accept your diplomatic solutions? Elena asked. It's because we learned that when civilized beings feel threatened, they don't negotiate. They exterminate, she gestured toward Chancellor Kethvex. The Chancellor didn't send us a list of demands before he attacked our colonies. He didn't threaten economic sanctions or diplomatic isolation. He simply decided that humans were a problem and tried to solve that problem with genocide. Elena walked closer to the Zephyrian platform, close enough to see her reflection in Kethvex's compound eyes. And when we begged this council for help, when we showed you the bodies of our children and pleaded for intervention, you told us that war was regrettable but that both sides bore responsibility for the conflict. She turned back to address the full assembly. So we learned? We learned that mercy is seen as weakness in this galaxy. We learned that other species will watch you die if it's convenient for them. We learned that the only protection against genocide is the ability to commit it yourself. The chamber was dead silent now. You're afraid of us, Elena continued, and several delegates flinched as if she had struck them. You're afraid because, for the first time in galactic history, humans have shown that we can destroy an empire without wanting to rule it. We can wage total war without seeking conquest. We can break your military power and then walk away, leaving you alive but helpless. She activated one final hologram showing the current positions of human fleets throughout Zephyrian space. Ships, surrounding every major world, but not landing on them. Forces capable of glassing planets but using surgical strikes instead. This terrifies you more than any conqueror ever could, Elena said. Because conquerors want things. Territory, resources, slaves, tribute. You can negotiate with greed. You can't negotiate with justice. Elena walked back to the center of the platform, her footsteps echoing in the silence. So here's humanity's message to the galaxy. We didn't start this war, but we're going to finish it. Not because we want the Zephyrian Empire's territory or resources, but because 2.3 billion humans died screaming while you all looked the other way. She looked directly at each delegation in turn. And if any of you ever decide that genocide might solve your problems, remember this moment. Remember that somewhere in the galaxy there's a species that values justice more than profit, that fights for principles rather than territory, and that never, ever forgets. Deep beneath the ruins of Geneva, in a bunker that had once been a subway station, Fleet Admiral Victor Chun sat at a metal table surrounded by the most dangerous humans in the galaxy. The command center hummed with quiet activity as hundreds of officers coordinated the largest military operation in human history. Holographic displays showed the positions of human fleets across 12 star systems, each one a dagger pointed at the heart of Zephyrian civilization. Chun looked older than his 53 years. The left side of his face bore the twisted scars of plasma burns from the defense of Mars, when he had pulled 17 wounded soldiers from a burning transport while Zephyrian fighters strafed the landing pad. His left arm was mechanical now, replaced after shrapnel had torn the original to pieces, but his mind was as sharp as ever. And right now it was focused on the datapad that Commander Liu had just placed in front of him. The Galactic Council's official peace proposal, Liu said quietly. She was young for a commander, barely 30, but she had earned her rank in the grinding battles of the outer colonies. Her entire family had been on New Tokyo when the Zephyrians turned it into a dead rock. Chun read through the terms slowly. Return of all occupied Zephyrian territory. Exchange of prisoners, a formal non-aggression pact. Reparations totaling 1 trillion galactic credits. The kind of deal that politicians would call generous and historians would call merciful around the table. His staff waited in silence. These were people who had watched their worlds burn, who had seen their families die, who had spent 15 years learning how to kill Zephyrians more efficiently. General Maria Santos had lost her twin daughters in the New Geneva massacre. Colonel David Kim's parents had died in the poison gas attacks on Luna Colony. Every person in this room carried scars, both visible and hidden. "They want to buy their way out," said Santos, her voice flat and emotionless. She spoke like that now, ever since the day she had identified her daughter's bodies in a refugee camp. "They think we're merchants who can be paid off." Chun sat down. A data pattern activated the central hologram. The display showed current fleet positions in brilliant detail. Human ships surrounded every major Zephyrian world, but not in the way conquering armies usually positioned themselves. There were no landing craft, no troop transports, no occupation forces. Instead, humanity had deployed precision strike fleets. Ships designed for one purpose: destroying everything that had made the Zephyrian Empire possible. "Look at this," Chun sighed, pointing to the tactical display. "Zephyr Prime, their capital world, population 4 billion. Our ships could glass that planet in 6 hours, turn it into a lifeless ball of rock, just like they did to our colonies." The room stayed quiet. Everyone knew the Admiral was building to a point. "But we haven't touched their civilians, have we?" Chun continued. "Instead, we've systematically destroyed every military base, every government building, every weapons factory. We've crippled their ability to make war while leaving their people alive." Colonel Kim leaned forward. "Sir, with respect, their people cheered when our colonies burned? They celebrated the cleansing of the human plague." Chun nodded. "Yes, they did, but we're not them, are we? We're not going to murder children because their parents are monsters." He changed the hologram to show a different view, the slow destruction of Zephyrian military power over the past 5 years. Base after base, fleet after fleet, systematically eliminated with surgical precision. It was the most careful campaign of destruction in galactic history. "They still don't understand," Chun said, studying the faces of his officers. "The Zephyrians think this is about territory, about resources, about dominance. They're offering us money and land because that's how their minds work. They think we want to rule their empire." Santos gave a bitter laugh. "We don't want their empire. We want justice." "Exactly." Chun walked to the wall display showing human fleet movements. "Look at what we've actually done. We haven't conquered a single Zephyrian world. We haven't established human colonies in their space. We haven't enslaved their population or stolen their resources." Commander Liu spoke up. "We focused entirely on dismantling their ability to threaten other species." "Which terrifies them more than conquest would," Chun observed. "Conquerors. They understand. Empires they can negotiate with. But an enemy that doesn't want anything except justice? That's something completely outside their experience." He thought back to his conversation with a captured Zephyrian general 3 months ago. The alien had been genuinely confused by human behavior. "Why do you not take our territory?" The general had asked through his translator. "Why do you not establish colonies in our systems? What do you gain from this pointless destruction?" Chun had tried to explain, but the concepts didn't translate well. How do you make a predator species understand that some things matter more than gain? How do you explain to creatures who saw genocide as a tool that humans valued justice over? "Profit? Sir," Lieutenant Brooks interrupted from her communications station. "We're receiving updated intelligence from Task Force 7. They've completed the neutralization of the Kepler shipyards." Chun nodded. The Kepler shipyards had been one of the Zephyrian Empire's primary military construction facilities. For 800 years, those shipyards had built the dreadnoughts that kept dozens of species in line. Now they were space debris. "Any civilian casualties?" he asked. "None, sir." The evacuation warnings were broadcast for 72 hours before the strike. All workers were safely relocated. That was the pattern humanity had followed throughout the war. Warn the civilians, give them time to evacuate, then destroy the military targets. It was expensive, time-consuming, and strategically complex. But it was the right thing to do. General Santos looked up from her own datapad. Admiral intelligence reports that several Zephyrian colony worlds are requesting to surrender individually. They want to negotiate separate peace deals. Chun wasn't surprised. The Zephyrian Empire had always been held together by fear and superior military force. With their fleets in ruins and their government in chaos, individual worlds were starting to make their own decisions about survival. What are they offering? He asked. Complete demilitarization. Reparations to human survivors. Some are even offering to turn over war criminals for trial. Chung considered this. It was tempting to accept these individual surrenders, to start the process of winding down the war. But it would also let the central government off the hook, allow them to claim that the real criminals were just rogue planetary governors. No individual deals, he decided. The Empire stands together or falls together. They made this a war of extinction, and they're going to answer for it as a united government. Colonel Kim frowned. Sir, that might prolong the fighting. Cost more human lives? Maybe, Chun admitted. But if we let them fragment into dozens of small governments, we'll spend the next century hunting down war criminals and dealing with insurgencies. Better to finish this properly. He turned back to the holographic display, studying the positions of his fleets. Each dot of light represented thousands of human sailors and soldiers, people who had volunteered to risk everything for justice. They deserved leadership that wouldn't waste their sacrifices for the sake of political convenience. Besides, Chun added quietly, the galaxy is watching. Every species with expansionist dreams, every would-be conqueror, every government that thinks genocide might solve their problems. They need to see what happens when you try to exterminate humanity. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. This war wasn't just about punishing the Zephyrians. It was about establishing a precedent that would protect not just humans, but every other species that might face extinction in the future. Chun looked at the peace proposal one more time, then deleted it from his datapad. Send a message to the Galactic Council, he said. Tell them we appreciate their concern, but humanity isn't interested in negotiations. When Chancellor Kethvex is ready to discuss unconditional surrender and war crimes tribunals, we'll listen. Until then, the war continues. The Galactic Council chamber was the most beautiful room Ambassador Elena Vasquez had ever seen, and she hated every inch of it. Crystal walls curved up toward a dome that showed the swirling colors of the nebula outside, while elegant platforms floated in perfect formation around the central speaking area. 12 different alien species had their representatives here, each platform designed to accommodate their unique biology. It was the kind of place built to inspire awe and cooperation, the kind of place where civilized beings came together to solve problems through dialogue and compromise. Elena found it disgusting. She sat in the human observation booth, watching the alien politicians fidget in their seats like children called to the principal's office. For 15 years, these same beings had ignored humanity's calls for help. Some had even cheered when the Zephyrians announced their cleansing operation against the aggressive human species. Now, they were all here because Chancellor Kethvex of the Zephyrian Empire had finally done something unprecedented. He had asked for help. The Chancellor moved slowly toward the central platform, his massive insect-like form looking smaller than Elena remembered. The last time she had seen him was during a prisoner exchange 3 years ago, when he had stood tall and defiant, his bioluminescent markings pulsing with the confident colors of a predator. Today, those same markings flickered weakly like a dying light bulb. Elena adjusted her earpiece as the universal translator calibrated to Kethvex's clicking speech patterns. She had learned to understand some Zephyrian during her 2 years in their prison camps, but she preferred the cold, mechanical voice of the translator. It made their words feel less real, less personal. Honored members of the Galactic Council, Kethvex began, his forearms spread in what Elena knew was a gesture of submission among his people. I come before you today to formally request mediation in our conflict with the human species. A ripple of shocked whispers ran through the chamber. The Zephyrians had ruled this sector of space for over 1,000 years. They were the apex predators, the species that other aliens feared and respected. They had never asked anyone for anything. Elena smiled coldly and activated her personal recorder. This moment needed to be preserved for history. Representative Dalthara of the Hegemony of Worlds spoke first, her crystalline form chiming like broken glass. Chancellor, surely this is premature. The conflict has been ongoing for only 15 standard years. Many territorial disputes last much longer. Elena bit back a laugh. 15 years was nothing to species that lived for centuries. To humans, it was a generation of children growing up knowing only war. The situation has evolved beyond our initial projections, Kethvex replied, and Elena could hear the admission of failure even through the translator's emotionless voice. Human military capabilities have exceeded all estimates. Their fleet strength grows while ours diminishes. That was putting it mildly. Elena had access to the latest intelligence reports from Human Military Command. In the past year alone, humanity had destroyed 17 major Zephyrian installations, captured 43 warships, and liberated 8 conquered worlds that the Zephyrians had taken from other species decades ago. The humans weren't just winning, they were dismantling the Zephyrian Empire piece by piece. Perhaps, suggested Counselor Rex of the Trade Federation, his blob-like form rippling with nervous energy, we should hear from the human representative before proceeding. All eyes turned to Elena's observation booth. She had been sitting quietly for 2 hours, letting them talk among themselves while they pretended she wasn't there. It was the same way they had treated humanity for the past 15 years, acknowledging their existence only when absolutely necessary. Elena stood slowly and walked to the lift that would take her down to the main floor. She had practiced this moment in her mind countless times, but now that it was here, she felt strangely calm. The lift descended in silence while every being in the chamber watched her. Elena knew what they saw: a middle-aged human woman in a simple black diplomatic uniform, unremarkable except for the pale scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw. A souvenir from the Zephyrian interrogation camps. She had been a junior diplomat on New Geneva when the attack happened, part of a cultural exchange program designed to build bridges between species. Instead, she had spent 2 years learning exactly what the Zephyrians thought of human civilization. The lift reached the main floor and Elena stepped out, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet chamber. She walked past the floating platforms of alien representatives who had spent decades dismissing humanity as primitive newcomers, past the delegates who had voted against investigating Zephyrian war crimes, past the species who had profited from selling weapons to both sides while calling for peaceful resolution. She reached the central platform and looked up at Kethvex. Even diminished, he towered over her, his forearms ending in claws that could tear through steel. She had seen those claws used on human prisoners who asked too many questions. "Chancellor," she said in perfect Zephyrian, causing a stir throughout the chamber, "you look tired." Kethvex's compound eyes focused on her with what might have been surprise. "Ambassador Vasquez, you have learned our language." "I had excellent teachers," Elena replied, switching back to Standard Galactic. "Your interrogators were very thorough." An uncomfortable silence fell over the chamber. Most of the council members knew that Elena had been captured, but none of them had ever asked about the details. It was easier to pretend that such unpleasantness didn't happen to civilized beings. "We are here," Kethvex continued, clearly wanting to move past the awkward moment, "to propose a formal ceasefire. The Zephyrian Empire is prepared to offer significant territorial concessions, prisoner exchanges, and reparations in the amount of 1 trillion galactic credits." Elena let the numbers hang in the air for a moment. 1 trillion credits was an enormous sum, enough to rebuild entire worlds. It was the kind of offer that was supposed to make humans grateful and compliant. "How generous," Elena said finally. "Tell me, Chancellor, what made you decide that human lives suddenly have value?" Ambassador, interrupted Representative Dalthara. Surely we can discuss terms in a more constructive manner. Elena turned to face the crystalline being. Constructive? Where was your concern for construction when human colonies were burning? Where was the Galactic Council when we begged for peacekeepers, for mediators, for anyone to step in and stop the slaughter? She gestured toward the various alien representatives. Half of you cheered when the Zephyrians announced their cleansing operation. You called us aggressive. You said we needed to be taught our place in the galactic community. The situation was complex, mumbled Counselor Rex. There were reports of human military buildup, concerns about territorial expansion. Elena laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make several aliens flinch. Military buildup? We had 12. Patrol ships and a handful of exploration vessels. Our most advanced weapon was a mining laser. We were gardeners and teachers and shopkeepers who happened to live on worlds that Chancellor Kethvex decided belonged to his empire. She walked closer to the Zephyrian leader, close enough to see her reflection in his compound eyes. Do you remember what you told me during my interrogation, Chancellor? You said humans were like weeds, ugly, fast-growing, and useful only when burned away to make room for better things. Kethvex said nothing, but his bioluminescent markings dimmed further. Elena turned back to address the full council. You want to know why we won't accept your generous offer of peace? It's because you taught us something important about this galaxy. You taught us that when civilized beings feel threatened, they don't negotiate, they exterminate. You taught us that mercy is seen as weakness and weakness invites attack. The chamber was completely silent now. So thank you, Chancellor. Thank you for showing us exactly what kind of universe we live in. We're much better prepared now. Admiral Katya Rodriguez stood in the quiet corridor of humanity's largest space station, staring at a wall that stretched further than her eyes could see. The memorial wall of New Geneva held 2.3 billion names etched in black metal, each one representing a life lost during what historians now called the Centauri Massacre. But for those who lived through it, no fancy name could capture the horror of that day 15 years ago. The holographic displays flickered softly above each section of names, showing faces of the dead, children who never got to grow up, parents who died protecting families that died anyway, teachers, doctors, farmers, shopkeepers, ordinary people living ordinary lives until the day the sky turned to fire. Rodriguez touched one particular name with her scarred fingers. Her younger brother had been studying engineering on New Geneva when it happened. He was supposed to graduate that week. Instead, his final message to her was a panicked video call showing ships descending from orbit like metallic thunderclouds. Katya, something's wrong, he had said, his young face twisted with confusion. The government says we need to evacuate, but there's nowhere to go. These ships, they're huge and they're not responding to any communications. That transmission cut off 23 minutes before the first weapon fired, the aliens called themselves the Zephyrian Empire. They looked like giant insects walking upright, with hard shells that gleamed like polished armor and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. When they finally spoke to humanity, their message was simple and terrifying. Humans were a disease that needed to be cured. Rodriguez remembered watching the news feeds in horror as entire cities vanished in green light. The Zephyrians didn't just kill people, they destroyed everything humans had built. Schools, hospitals, parks where children played, even pet shelters. They turned the oceans acidic and poisoned the air itself. 3 beautiful worlds that had taken humanity decades to build became dead rocks in a matter of hours. Admiral, a voice said behind her. Rodriguez turned to see Lieutenant Beck approaching, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. Beck was one of the war orphans, kids who lost everything in the massacre and grew up in military academies, training for the day they could fight back. The ceremony is starting in the main hall, Beck said quietly. He was looking at the wall too, probably searching for his own family's names. Most of the younger officers had that same look, a mix of sadness and cold anger that never quite went away. Rodriguez nodded and followed him down the corridor. Every year on this date, survivors gathered to remember, not just to mourn, but to remind themselves why they kept fighting. The war had been going on for 15 years now, and some people were getting tired. Some politicians back on Earth whispered about the cost, about whether revenge was worth the resources humanity was spending. Those politicians had never pulled bodies from burning buildings or watched children die from poison gas. The main hall was packed with thousands of people. Most wore the deep blue uniform of the Human Defense Force, but civilians were there too. People who had lost everything and rebuilt their lives with nothing but determination and rage. They didn't talk much during these ceremonies. What was there to say? Everyone in that room had lost someone. Everyone understood. General Torres took the stage first. She was older now, her hair completely gray, but her voice still carried the authority that had held humanity together during those first terrible months after the attack. She had been governor of New Geneva's northern continent when the Zephyrians came. Somehow, she survived by hiding in an underground mining facility for 6 days while her world died above her. 15 years ago today, Torres began, her words echoing through the silent hall, we learned that we were not alone in the universe. We learned that among the stars there were creatures who saw other thinking beings as nothing more than pests to be eliminated. The crowd listened without moving. They had heard versions of this speech every year, but it never got easier. They came without warning, without demands, without mercy. They didn't want our resources or our territory. They simply wanted us gone because we dared to exist in their galaxy. Rodriguez closed her eyes and remembered those first days after the massacre. Earth's remaining fleets had rushed to the colonies, but they arrived too late to save anyone. All they found were dead worlds and a few Zephyrian ships still in orbit, apparently studying the effectiveness of their weapons. The battle that followed wasn't really a battle, it was a slaughter. Human ships were built for exploration and trade, not war. The Zephyrians cut through them like they were made of paper. But humanity had one advantage the aliens hadn't expected. They were absolutely furious. Captain Williams had commanded the first ship to ram a Zephyrian vessel. His destroyer was already crippled, his crew mostly dead, but he aimed his ship at the alien flagship and pushed the engines to maximum. The explosion took out both ships, and Williams became the first human to kill Zephyrians in combat. After that, everything changed. Earth's shipyards worked around the clock. Every available resource went to building warships. Humanity studied the wreckage of Zephyrian technology and learned to copy it. They developed new weapons, new tactics, new ways to hurt the creatures that had hurt them. We are here today, Torres continued, not just to remember our dead, but to honor our promise to them. We swore that their deaths would not be forgotten, and that those responsible would face justice. The crowd murmured agreement. Justice, that was the word that kept humanity united. Not revenge, not conquest, but justice. The difference mattered to people like Rodriguez, who wore uniforms and swore oaths and tried to stay civilized even while fighting monsters. After the ceremony, Rodriguez returned to her quarters to find an encrypted message waiting on her personal communicator. She read it twice before the meaning sank in. The Galactic Council, the organization that governed relations between alien species, was calling an emergency session. After 15 years of watching humanity and the Zephyrians tear each other apart, they finally wanted to get involved, Rodriguez laughed, but there was no humor in it. Where had the Galactic Council been when human colonies were burning? Some of their member species had even supported the Zephyrian intervention, claiming that humanity was too aggressive and needed to be controlled. Now, with Zephyrian fleets retreating on every front and their empire crumbling under human assault, suddenly everyone wanted peace. Rodriguez walked to her window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, human ships were hunting down the last Zephyrian strongholds. Young officers like Beck were risking their lives to finish what the aliens had started. The galaxy was finally learning to fear humanity, and that fear was the only thing that might prevent another massacre. But peace? That was a word for people who hadn't watched worlds die. Rodriguez touched the memorial bracelet on her wrist, a small piece of metal salvaged from New Geneva's wreckage. She wore it every day to remember why she kept fighting, the Galactic Council could call all the emergency sessions they wanted. Humanity would listen politely, nod at the right moments, and then continue doing what needed to be done. Because some wounds never heal, and some debts can only be paid in full.